Well, thank you very much, Ron, and thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see such a nice turnout in an evening. Off season, I understand, in New Mexico, but it seems like a pretty perfect to me. I'm very glad to be here. I'm delighted that Ron asked me to revisit a work that I conceived in the 1990s, published in 2006 and republished in 2013, and it's become timely again. Obviously, the subject tonight of Philosemitism and Antisemitism is not a light subject, so nevertheless, I feel obligated to start with a joke or two. A couple in Berlin in the 1930s are sitting at the dinner table, and the wife notes that the husband is reading Der Stürmer, which I'm sure most of you know it was the vilest of the vile of Nazi propaganda. And she says, we're facing persecution, discrimination, who knows what next. How can you read that trash? And he says, look, when I look at the regular news, it's depressing. When I read this, we control the banks, we control the press. Gallows humor, but humor. Another one, which will lead into the subject, what's to be preferred, the anti-Semite or the Philosemite? Answer, the anti-Semite, at least you know he's not lying. Now, I totally disagree with that joke. In fact, the whole book is a rebuttal of that viewpoint. But it does allow me to at least introduce my two terms before I get going. Anti-Semitism and Philosemitism were coined in 1880 at the same time in a controversy that broke out over the role of the Jews in Germany. Anti-Semitism was coined specifically to oppose Jews, but not on the basis of religion, on the basis of what would eventually become race, dominated by race. But basically, anti-Semitism was animated, modern political anti-Semitism was animated by the idea that the religion of the Jews is irrelevant to our hatred of the Jew. What matters is again, ultimately the blood. And at the same time, the term Philosemitism was coined to describe all those who were opposed to anti-Semitism. And I'm going to use Philosemitism, which I try to defend in my book as something that really did exist in Germany in the years before Hitler. I'm going to defend it. And I'm going to mean by what I mean by Philosemitism is pretty much any person or action or group that acts in a way that is beneficial to the Jews individually or as a collective. In other words, I'm not going to worry too much about qualifications or about ultimate motives, because I think if you did that, as I'll explain tonight, you'll see there is an enormous amount of ambivalence, an enormous amount of qualification in the defense of Jews and Judaism from 1871 to 1932. But I don't want to spend too much time on qualifying the term itself in the same way to take it right to the present. And when we get to the question and answer period, we'll have ample time to talk about the findings of a different era and a different country to our own situation that we find ourselves in. In the same way that today, if somebody like Richard Spencer on the alt-right says, well, I'm primarily motivated by love of my fellow white Europeans, I don't really care that the person doesn't say, I'm an anti-Semite, when it's clear, right, that all of their policies, thinking, and discourse is designed to harm not only Jews, but actually all people who don't share his imaginary white European background. So just as we would immediately dismiss the idea of that being not anti-Semitic, I think we should apply that same standard to philosemitism and say, well, they have some problems, but they're definitely, to be simplistic, on our side. In the same way, and this is maybe more controversial, and we'll talk about this if you wish. In the same way, on the far left these days, if you say that there's only one country in the world that doesn't deserve to be a country at all, and that just happens to be the one country in the world that has a Jewish majority, I consider that anti-Semitic. If you say, and I'm sure I will not be unanimous in my view here, but if you say Palestine from river to sea, and you have no particular plan as to what to do with the non-Palestinians who happen to be in between that river and that sea, I consider that also anti-Semitic in any event. So there is obviously some relevance to this study to today, but let's proceed, and then we'll have plenty of times to bat it about. Okay, how did I get interested in this in the 1990s? It seems a lot more civilized than it does today, at least to me, probably to you too. Why did I get interested in this? Basically, I got interested by teaching courses on the Holocaust and on German Jewry, and the analysis, the scholarly analysis by that period had gotten pretty sophisticated, and scholars had said, you know what? Not every German was a Hitler, a Heydrich, a Himmler. In fact, most weren't. You had an ideological core who were clearly motivated by the Nazi ideology, as it's called. Then you had a much larger group of what some scholars would call a passive-aggressive ring, in which people had deep-seated anti-Jewish prejudices, whether from religious upbringing or whether from the right-wing press or whether from things they'd heard from their parents. There was a lot of animosity there, but it needed to be activated. And then possibly an even larger group, latent anti-Semitism, the scholars said, well, there are a lot of people who had some general low-level prejudices against Jews, the way majorities often have low-level or prejudices against minorities. But really, all you need for this group is to stand by and do nothing. And actually, that's good enough to enact a policy of legal and illegal discrimination and persecution, which is, of course, what happened to the Jews from 1933 to 1939, before the beginning of the Second World War. And this is made even easier when a lot of these groups are predisposed to think that the ills that Germany suffered in that era, and there were many, I can see this is a pretty well-versed audience, so I won't go into it, but runaway inflation, the humiliations of the Versailles Treaty, the reparations payments, and the list goes on. Just simply the dislocations of modernity and Weimar culture, the Weimar Republic from 1920 to 1933, in a way for a lot of people was itself an offense against what a lot of people looked at romantically, an older, more conservative Germany that had already ceased to exist. But nobody knew exactly why, and nobody was really very happy with the Weimar Republic. That was it was born under a dark star. It had communists on the left and fascists on the right, and lukewarm supporters generally in the middle. So there were many things to blame, and on top of that, the Nazis were really quite adept at rewarding people for looking the other way. There was an enormous amount of essentially goods and buildings and businesses that German Jewry needed to sell, abandon, cough up at enormous benefit to a whole range of other Germans, and that was also an inducement. Okay. Finally, I looked at all of this material really mainly for preparing for classes. And I said, well, are you telling me there were really no Germans at all who could stomach Jews, who liked Jews? I just found that inconceivable in a very large modern society. And in fact, I knew it wasn't true because, first of all, there were some very famous intermarriages. I'll get to that in a minute. But also because when something isn't a problem, you don't need to legislate against it. So on the left here, on your left, Rassenschande, race shaming, that's just a fancy typical compound word for what we would call intermarriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. And this, of course, was a very serious matter for the Nazis. It was illegalized. People were jailed for it. People had to go into exile if they were an intermarried couple. And basically, this was woven into a very complicated and ugly mythology about racial purity and the way racial purity could be compromised. Even what we would think of as even less, even harder to believe, just befriending Jews became a crime in Germany. And you could, again, by the late 30s, you could be dragged off to jail for showing overmuch sympathy toward your Jewish friends and neighbors. I was just this past week reviewing a manuscript about Rabbi Leo Beck. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of him. He was one of the most, maybe the leading rabbi in Germany in the 1930s. He eventually went to Theresienstadt concentration camp and spent his last years in London. And I was reading that Leo Beck, in the late 30s, was dissuading some of his non-Jewish friends from visiting because he was afraid they were going to get dragged off. So I knew that there was a fair amount, which is kind of what we would expect as human beings, that there was actually a fair amount of good relations between German Jews and German non-Jews. This really wasn't all that rare. There were over 100,000 people classified as Mischlinge, disgusting phrase, but basically mixed race people. So, I mean, it was hardly a rarity. But on top of that, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. On top of that, I happen to know about a few very famous instances of intermarriage, and I'll tell you a little bit about this. By the way, everyone can hear me okay? Okay, good. I'm going to speak for maybe a half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Sound good? Okay. So this woman, you've never heard of her. Her name is Nahida Remy, or you probably have never heard of her, but I'll bet you've been to libraries that have her book, The Jewish Woman, on the shelves. And the only thing here that you wouldn't know otherwise is that she was born a Catholic and ultimately converted to Judaism, wrote this very popular book. It's at the University of Oklahoma libraries. And I thank Ron for making his little plug for our Judaic Studies program. I hope you'll encourage some of your children or grandchildren to take a look. We do have a very comprehensive program, a very nice Hillel. We welcome New Mexicans. If it was up to me, we'd welcome Mexicans too, but that's another problem that we will talk about perhaps. In any event, Nahida Remy, ultimately she writes this book. It becomes really quite popular, and she says in this book, I'll paraphrase it since I can't see my notes. Basically, as I came to know these people and I came to study about them, I came to love them, which is a great thing. I wish everyone who took my class has ultimately felt that way. I hope many do. And interestingly enough, later in life, she married a Jewish guy named Maurice Lazarus. I'll talk about him some more because he's the principal Jewish protagonist in this Berlin anti-Semitic controversy that breaks out in 1880. And his name's Maurice Lazarus, and he was a professor in Berlin in social sciences. It was very, very difficult for Jews in the before First World War to get a position in the professoriate. There were lots and lots of Jewish Ph.D.s, but generally they were private instructors. They had a license to give lessons, but they didn't have professorial rank. And in Germany, that's a big deal because it means you're an actual civil servant and you have all sorts of protections. Her husband, eventual husband, happened to be one of them. Okay, oops. Oh, there they are. That's a picture of the two of them. Another rather person who was not so well known anymore, but she was pretty famous in her day. You've heard of Martin Buber, I'm sure. Of course, this is his wife, Paula Winkler, who wrote under the male alias George Monk. And this was, of course, pretty common in the 19th century, even in the late 19th century. And it's kind of interesting that somewhat like George Eliot, far more famous, the Victorian era novelist who writes this fantastic pre-Zionist novel, Daniel Deronda, which becomes a huge hit and becomes one of the Zionists' favorite books. It's in Hebrew. By the way, Nahida Remy's book is in Hebrew too, The Jewish Woman. Unlike George Eliot in England, who basically had to live kind of as a social pariah, George Monk this was already the second decade of the 20th century. She's living in avant-garde circles in Frankfurt and Vienna. She's accepted, and she marries Martin Buber, and there they are. They raise a family in Israel. Ultimately, they too, like Leo Baeck and many, many, many others who are not famous, many who are famous, many who are not famous, had to flee Germany in the 30s or Austria once it was annexed. And she and Martin Buber were very famous figures in their day, and in Israel they're still very well known. Finally, the most famous of all of these intermarried couples was Thomas Mann, one of the probably the greatest German novelist of the 20th century, and his wife Katja Mann-Pringsheim, or Katja Pringsheim Mann. And Katja had grown up in the house of a Munich mathematician whose name was Alfred Pringsheim. He was Jewish. He was Jewish the way a lot of German Jews were in that era, in the turn of the last century, 19th to 20th century. It didn't mean he went to shul every week. He didn't lay tefillin. That would have been absolutely foreign to a highly cultured fan of Wagner, who taught. Yes, I know. That Wagner. All these characters will come back a few times in my talk. Who taught mathematics at Munich, but he and his children grew up, and Katja and Thomas married. He was originally a Lutheran, and one of the interesting things about Mann is there were many interesting things about Thomas Mann, and that could be a different talk, a different night. But as he became more and more, as he traveled left politically, which he did especially in the Weimar era, and became a supporter of Weimar, and ultimately he gave broadcasts during the Second World War and Voice of America attacking the Nazis and saying this isn't the real Germany. And Mann in the course of his longest and I think one of his best novels, Joseph and His Brothers, he gets very interested in incorporating all sorts of stuff, Egyptian mythology, ideas about religion and the recurrence of ideas from Jung. And guess what? Rabbinic Midrash. His novel is just sprinkled with all sorts of Jewish folk stories, Rabbinic Midrash, that he gets from German translations of the Midrash, from Rabbi Joseph Horowitz, who is a very well-known scholar, and basically, as he travels left politically, he also becomes more and more outspoken about the European debt to Jewish culture and the European debt to Jewry generally, to the point where and his publisher, Simon Fisher Verlag, was a Jewish publishing house. A lot of his early supporters were Jewish. To the end of his life, by the end of his life, you would have to say, or I would say, you don't have to say anything, I would say Thomas Mann probably ought to be described, along with many other things, as a Philosemite. He's supporting the cause of Jews and Judaism and defending it actively. He's not just someone who's disgusted with the Nazis, as many people were. It goes well beyond that. So those are a couple of instances, of individual instances, and I really could multiply this quite a lot, but I think the point's made. And now I want to talk a little bit about this conflict, where it starts, and the reason I do spend a little bit of time with this, is because this is the era in which anti-Semitism becomes something more than traditional religious Jewish hatred. It becomes a universal, an international movement, propaganda organs all over the place, congresses, petitions, anti-Semitic parties. In other words, something happens around this era. You're my historian, so I don't ever think, I never relies too much on a single date. But around this era, in the 1870s, 1880s, something happens, and by the end of the 19th century, there's an active force called modern political anti-Semitism. And I think one of the key moments is here. It starts mainly in Berlin. I know these aren't very exciting pictures, but I might as well. If I have pictures of the people, I'd rather show you. On the left is a fellow. Both are historians. One is a modern historian. And this guy's name is Heinrich von Trichka. He's becomes one of the most important figures in modern anti-Semitism. He coins the phrase "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," the Jews are our misfortune. And because he is a professor and an esteemed one, he sort of gives a imprimatur of legitimacy to a lot of vulgar anti-Semitic agitation that's occurring in the press and pamphlets, acts of violence on the streets. And he sort of says, well, you know what? We really do have a problem here. There are Polish pants-selling lads, that's his phrase, who come streaming over the border every year, and we have to control it. And he really puts, again, I'll repeat myself, the patina of legitimacy on this kind of anti-Jewish sentiment. And so he's an important figure. He's opposed by plenty of people. One of the people, and since we're interested above all in Philosemitism tonight, I'm going to talk more about his opponent than about him. His opponent, Theodore Momsen, is a Roman historian. He was the most famous Roman historian. If any of you ever did Roman history in college and remembered it all, you probably read or used stuff that Momsen had compiled, even if it was translated in English. And Momsen is a liberal stalwart. He's he fights for, I don't want to rush ahead here. And he is the most ardent Christian, and he's really, it would be more accurate to say non-Jew. as much as Alfred Pringsheim, Thomas Mann's father-in-law, didn't lay tefillin, Theodore Momsen didn't go to church every Sunday and take communion either. I mean, we're talking about an era in which many people were no longer organized by their religious lives, and he was certainly one. He was first and foremost a scholar. And this, I want to just point out a few things about his defense of Jews and Judaism, which are really problematic. And then I'll talk about some other defenders of Jews and Judaism, also very problematic. And once I've done that, you'll have a pretty good sense of why the liberal defense of Jewry was not more effective and not more clear in the period under discussion. So, okay. Sorry. I'm a little unused to this computer. Excuse me. So one of Momsen's points is that, of course, we're going to defend the equal civil and political liberties of Jews. The Jews were, their emancipation took place first in 1812, and then it was reaffirmed in 1870 with the creation of the German Empire. And there's no question in Momsen's idea that you can turn back the clock. The Jews are equal citizens, and they're here to stay. However, and then we were about 6 or 7 lines up from the bottom, we cannot, however, protect the Jews from the estrangement and inequality with which the German Christian still tends to treat them. And here is, I would say, one of the chinks in the armor of German liberalism. You'll have to take my word on it, but Momsen here is speaking for German liberals at large. In other words, we can protect them on the books, but there's nothing we can really do about it if there isn't any social amity or intercourse, if there are not good relations between Jews and non-Jews in Germany. We don't have any means to rectify this. And this becomes a bit of a problem in my view, because in the end, how passionate can you defend a people if you really don't know them and really don't feel any need to know them? Okay. And this is from the same, and again, remember, I'm being a little tough on Momsen here, but remember, he's arguing against the anti-Semitic party and the anti-Semitic parties. Here, he says, Christianity isn't really Christianity in the medieval sense. It's just a cultural term now. And so he says, if it's possible for Jews, if they can't convert to Christianity for religious reasons, I understand that. That's okay. But if they can find their way to becoming Protestants, we call it light water baptism, unlike Catholics, where you really, there's a whole lot involved in it. He says, if they can become Christians, it would just make things easier for the amalgamation of German Jews into the body politic. He doesn't mean this maliciously, but I think we can all see the problems here, which is, for starters, Jews don't necessarily define themselves purely as a religious group. Secondly, why should a minority absolutely efface all traces of itself in order to be part of the majority? Why is that a demand? And the answer truly is, in this country, in this place and time, that was the demand. In other words, whether liberal or conservative, there were only a very, very few people who could, I hate to use a PC word, but I will, who could celebrate diversity as a good, or let's say even a word from a century ago that was already in use, cultural pluralism, all right, who had some understanding of cultural pluralism as potentially a source of strength for the nation, the way Americans at that time, like Horace Callan or Louis Brandeis, or Protestants like Hutchins Hapgood, the muckrakers, really did see that actually America could be, in some ways, a stronger place for having more than one type of population. That really just didn't have, that idea gained no traction in Germany in this era. So, finally, I think my last Momsen is that Momsen had an issue, and again, he's on our side. I must keep saying this on every slide, because if we were to talk about anti-Semitism and its emergence, this would be a different talk. Momsen says, I can't understand, well, you can see yourself, I can understand but not justify the numerous specifically Jewish societies which have been founded in Berlin and seem to serve no religious purpose. I should never join a philanthropic institution whose statutes would oblige me to support nobody but the people of Holstein. So, Jewish newspapers, Jewish federations, JCCs, distinguished lecture series, all of these things, Momsen simply can't. How can this do any good in forwarding the amalgamation or assimilation of Jews into Germany? These will only impede that progress. You know what? He was absolutely right. And in fact, yet another talk would be vehicles of modern secular Jewish identity in the diaspora. And there you'd have to talk at some length about Jewish periodicals, communal and national, organizations like the B'nai B'rith and the National Council of Jewish Women, which after all are not religious organizations, or Hadassah, or any number of vehicles modern Jews have actually innovated in order to find a meaningful way to express their Jewishness. And that's exactly what's happened. So it's not that Momsen is factually wrong. He's quite correct in seeing these German institutions, which many of them did start in Germany, as actually slowing the progress of Jews completely disappearing into the vastly larger German population. I don't think that would have happened anyway, but okay. And so he says at the very near the end of his letter, he says, look, the admission into a large nation, meaning Germany, has its price. The people of Hanover, Hessen, and Schleswig-Holstein are prepared to pay the price, and we feel they are giving up part of themselves. But we make this sacrifice to our common fatherland. The Jews, too, will not be led by another Moses into the promised land. Well, they didn't turn out to be right on that one. But you can see where he's going with this argument. Any regional, local kind of patois, linguistic difference, it all has to essentially become melded into a unified nation called Germany. Now this is 10 years after unification, we now have the political structure of a nation, but we're not yet a nation. And that's going to require sacrifice on the parts of everybody, but especially on the parts of people who aren't in the mainstream. Okay, that's Momsen's defense in 1880, and I must say, as you move forward up until the First World War at least, it doesn't change all that much. Variations on a theme. So for one defense that I saw often, and I'm giving you essentially a boiled down half-hour version of something that took a couple of years to research. So I'm kind of relying on you to trust my generalizations because they're based on an awful lot of time spent in the city archive in Cologne and in the National and University Library in Jerusalem, reading old German newspapers and other such stuff. Here's a guy, very Prussian aristocrat, Helmut von Gerlach, his autobiography From Right to Left. It's actually a great autobiography. I'm sorry no one's ever translated it. And he talks about the Jews, and in his path from right to left, he becomes quite an advocate of Jews. But now, take a look at the nature of his advocacy. I call this the extenuating circumstances defense. I have to read this one. Why are Jews lawyers and almost never judges? Only because the few Jews who are allowed to enter the judicial positions are unfailingly kept on the lowest steps. Why are Jews so unwarlike? Because in Prussia, not only the officer corps was shut to them, but also because they could not become reserve officers. Why were so few Jews artisans? Because until emancipation of 1812, they were shut out of these guilds. Why were the Jews not farmers? Because until 1812, they were not permitted to own lands. Why did Jews deal so often in money lending? Because under the authority of canon law, only they were permitted to deal in money lending. Now, I hate to say it, this is meant as a defense. He really does mean it as a defense. The problem is, I think, obvious. Some of these are woefully out-of-date generalizations. There were not Jewish moneylenders in 1912 when he writes this book. I mean, maybe there were, but there were Jewish bankers, but there were even bigger non-Jewish bankers. It was a modern industrial economic society. Jews are not owning farms more and more and more. Guess what? Germans are not owning farms more and more and more. They're all leaving all those small, putzish, little cute German towns, and they're going to Hanover and Breslau and Frankfurt and Munich and Berlin because it's a much better, more exciting, and easier life to live if you urbanize in this period. And so all of these defenses of Jews, first of all, it's all negative, right? It's not focused on Jews have, and that can also be very apologetic, but you know, it's noticeable. It was noticeable to me how absent it was. Someone wrote in 1933, it may be the saddest book ever. A guy by the name of Katznelson wrote a book called Juden im deutschen Kulturbereich, Jews in the German cultural orbit. And it was about a 1,500-page book of just paragraphs of these different German Jews in every field you could imagine who had accomplished something worthwhile. And, you know, it's a sad book because, of course, if objectivity were going to prevail, then the German Jews wouldn't have had any problems in the first place. Anyway, this is one defense, the extenuating circumstances defense. Whoops. Here's another defense. Here's another defense. This is what I call the search for another suspect defense. Sometimes this is like, well, Jews are, look, blacks are able to get equal, they didn't really know so much about Jim Crow. Blacks were able to get equal rights and thrive in America. Certainly Jews can do so in Germany. Or Muslims are certainly in the world and they're okay. Certainly Jews are at least as good as Muslims. That's the kind of defense generally you don't want. But this is a very common, but the most typical object of liberal defense was, well, our German Jews are not those Ostjuden. They're not those Polish Jews from the East, right? Still in their totally traditional garb. And here's a letter from a German writer named Karl Hillebrand to Maurice Lazarus, who we met at the beginning of this talk. He's the husband of Nahida Remy Lazarus, professor at the University of Berlin. And he's writing to Lazarus, and he says this: what we have to do seems clear to me, but you too must do something in order to hasten assimilation. Statistics prove little. Those who wander toward the West are a loss for the Germanizing direction of Jewry. This is my translation. It's a little awkward, but it's from the German, so it has to be. For those who are at most half Germanized, halb Germanisiert, those who wander, immigrate from the East and must first become Germanized. In other words, look, Maurice, we got a problem. Even as you, generation by generation, are becoming more Germanized, all the time there are German Jews coming from the East, coming from Poland, coming from Russia, who in a sense have to start the clock all over again because they come as Yiddish-speaking traditional Jews, and they have a long path to go until they're fully Germanized. And the real irony here in this letter, other than the nature of this kind of defense, which is you're just not there yet. This is sort of like a moving the goalposts defense. The other problem, the irony here, is that Maurice Lazarus himself grew up. Anyone here named Posen or Posner? Maybe, or know someone named Posner. That means you came from the Posen province, now Poznan. It's now part of Poland. It was part of Germany. And he grew up in a small town in Posen. He grew up in a traditional Jewish town that had a lot more similarities to the Anatevka of Sholem Alechem than it had to Alexander Doblin's Berlin Alexanderplatz. In other words, Maurice Lazarus himself is a perfect example of someone who pulled himself up from a basically poverty, traditional Yiddish-speaking background and became a professor in political science at the University of Berlin. So this is what his liberal friend writes to him. So this tells you, I think, a little bit, about the limitations of the German liberal defense of Jews and Judaism in this era. Interestingly enough, the person who I think put their finger on it absolutely the best is Nietzsche, the philosopher who everybody thinks was an ardent Nazi, and the Nazis wanted people to think he was an ardent Nazi. In fact, he thought the anti-Semites were morons, and he thought that Germans were really very immature as a people, and he thought the Jews were a noble and ancient race. He didn't like religion, Judaism or Christianity. That was a very typical theme in a lot of European philosophy. But Nietzsche's record on the issue of Jewishness was really more mixed than a lot of people think. Anyway, here's what he has to say about the Germans. This is from, I have never met a German yet who is favorably inclined toward the Jews, and however unconditionally all cautious and politic-minded men repudiated real anti-Jewishness, even this caution and policy is not directed against this class of feeling itself, but only against its dangerous immoderation, and especially against the distasteful and shameful way in which this immoderate feeling is expressed. One must not deceive oneself about that. I don't totally agree with him, but I mainly agree with him. Most of the baseline German culture had a negative response to Judentum, whether you translate that as Jewry, Jewishness, or Jews. And in Germany, Das Judentum can mean any of those three. So I think he exaggerates a wee bit because, as I hope I've shown, there actually were some people who became, in the course of their lives, honestly enthusiastic about Jews and about Jewish culture in a positive way. But on the whole, I think Nietzsche is right on target. The average German bore a fair amount of anti-Jewish stereotype. They grew up with it. That was part of their education. And it took some effort for them to really free themselves from it completely. Okay. I think that's thank you. That's a good. I'd be very, very eager to hear your impressions, and please.
So you said that around the Jews being emancipated?
Yes, that's a very good question. First of all, I will. do you think that I wouldn't mind retreading the first part too? That around 1880, more or less, there was this sudden modernization, you might say, and politicization of anti-Semitism, and that a lot of the defense of that was there some attention paid to the American Civil War and the emancipation of the blacks? And the answer is most definitely there was. And I think we now know that like Europeans paid quite a lot of attention to American events, and the liberals especially thought it was a good argument for them to make the case that, well, if American blacks could be given the vote, could be given, during the Reconstruction period at least, enfranchisement. This is before it all got rolled back, or at least a lot of it rolled back, that slavery could be ended, that this could be in some ways a good example. But I'm afraid to say it was used even more rhetorically as a double negative. Like, well, if you can do that with American Negroes, who are totally different, then you can do it with German Jews who are mainly different. And so I'm afraid that it becomes kind of a negative argument in a lot of ways. I might say, by the way, if I said that it just came out of nowhere in 1880, let me re-speak that a little bit and say not really came out of nowhere. Already with the unification of Germany in 1870, and already with the enormous economic changes that were underway in Europe, not just Germany, France too, England too, urbanization, and industrialization, and secularization, and the expansion of the franchise, the ending of a sort of a noblesse oblige relationship between giant landholders and workers. As all of that broke down, everything became very chaotic in late 19th century Europe, generally in the West. And it's not an accident that you also have this in France, the rise of anti-Semitism in France at the same time. Edward Drumont, maybe a little bit later in the 1890s, the Dreyfus Affair, of course, very notorious. This is happening in a lot of European nations. It happens in Austria, it happens in Hungary, that anti-Semitism becomes, and to use the word of the German-born Israeli historian Shulamit Volkov, it becomes a cultural code. In other words, one of the things that unfortunately didn't happen in this time is that philosemitism never became part of a liberal cultural code in the same way that anti-Semitism becomes part of a right-wing cultural code, so that you're in favor of agrarian tariffs, you're in favor of building a giant navy, and you don't like the influence of Jews on German life. You know what I mean? It becomes a right-wing cultural code in which you don't have to feel about any one of those single things super strongly, but you're more than happy to make alliance with people who have, say you really want to build a navy, say you really want German colonies, say you really want agrarian tariffs to protect East German farmers from Russian wheat, say you really want a place in the sun for Germany, that it will be seen as great as Great Britain. If you're in favor of all those things, good enough. We'll hate Jews too. And that's kind of how it worked. Sir?
To what extent does the teach entitled to the same protection?
Yeah, the gentleman's question is a good one and a mighty big one, and that is to what extent did the Christian animosity toward Judaism, baked in over centuries, already create fertile ground for other kinds of discrimination and persecution? It's an awfully hard question to answer. I mean, I would say you can see what happens maybe best under Hitler, because what happens then is you have an actual splitting in the Protestant churches in Germany between what are called the confessing church, people, famous names like Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who actually opposed the Nazis on principle. Because after all, if you take communion, according to Christianity, if you take communion and you become a Christian, that communion should override everything. It should override racial differences or ethnic differences. Thank you very much. And therefore they felt that it was a complete compromise of Christianity's fundamental principles to impose a racially based state on the German people. But you know what? On the other side of the Christian coin, on the Protestant coin, there was an Institute for the Eradication of Jewish Influence on German Life. That was a church institution, and that was in Eisenach, Germany. And the Protestant churches locally, by and large, supported the the Nazi government's desire to ferret out genealogical records. My God. I mean, when you think in the world of 23andMe, in those days, it took some legwork. You had to go through parish records throughout Germany to find out who had converted and when, in order to determine what percentage Jew they were, what percentage German, and there's no question. So I guess I am answering your question. I think on the whole, sir, there's no real question that the German church's behavior during the Second World War was absolutely atrocious. However, the behavior of the German academia was even worse. And no better were German scientists. In other words, if you look at what happened, now I'm going ahead 20, 30 years from what I've been talking about, the era I'm talking about. After 1930, I had my book in 1932, because after that, the game over. January 1933, the Nazis take over. March, April, you have the burning of the Reichstag and the first wave of people sent to concentration camps and martial law. And it's very quick, in my opinion, that already you're talking about a society where there isn't a free exchange or free intercourse of ideas. But the reality is, I can't think of a single German institution that wasn't badly corrupted by Nazism, and in many cases, enthusiastic supporters. The Catholic Church is a little different. The situation's a little different. They have a third player, the papacy, and after 1933, when Pope Pius, I think it was the 11th, but signed the Concordat with Rome, negotiated by the man who had become Pope Pius XII, Pacelli, that was already a signal for most German Catholics to essentially keep stum, keep quiet, and let the regime do what it will. There were, of course, some pretty admirable exceptions, but they were exceptions. Sir? You're next. Please. Well, the question, sort of the underlying question of the talk, and probably why Ron suggested that I talk about this rather than one of my other books. What are we supposed to learn from the failure of German philo-Semitism? That's what are we supposed to learn from it in our, I would say, very unsettling times. I of course, I don't have any real solution or really any answer. No historian ever does. That's why everyone goes into business school nowadays. However, I can tell you what did happen. So let me I can say what did happen and some things that I've concluded from it. So I'll do that. I think first of all, when you're talking about the situation of, I think either Jewry or I would go so far to say most endangered minorities or most minorities at risk, the determining factor, I'm sad to say, is usually not going to be the behavior of that minority. It's usually going to be the attitude of the majority. In other words, I'm not of the camp that the Jews should have done X, Y, or Z. At the end of the day, I don't think X, Y, or Z would have really mattered all that much. So that's sort of a depressing kind of takeaway on minority-majority relations. But I will say this, on a more hopeful note, some of what I found is encouraging because there's something called the contact hypothesis, which is if you actually get to know people and you get to know their culture and you get to know their values and their families, you actually can change your mind about them. So I came across quite a few cases of people who were disgusted with anti-Semitism and knew they didn't want to be anti-Semites anymore, but it was a much longer and slower process till they got to know Jewish friends, Jewish people, Jewish culture, and started to move in a direction that I would call philo-Semitic. It's more vectors than all one or all the other. And on the same theme exactly, it turns out that actual education and actual knowledge can be beneficial. In other words, one of the things I found in a lot of the people that I identified, a few dozen people and a few important organizations, the German peace movement was philo-Semitic. The parts of the socialist movement were philo-Semitic. Parts of the left liberal party were philo-Semitic. And what I found with a lot of these groups, some scientific circles were rather mixed between Jewish and non-Jewish people and socialized together, and it really did make a difference. And a lot of the people in 1933, I'm sure you know this, a lot of the people who went into exile in 1933 were not Jews. A lot of the people were Germans, left-wingers, Weimar Republic defenders, people who had been critical of the Nazis, people who knew they were no longer safe in Germany because of the company they kept and the views they expressed. Certainly, there was no more Lutheran or German a person than Thomas Mann, but he knew when he was on a book tour in 1933 in America, he was smart enough easily not to come back. And that was the case with a lot of non-Jews as well as Jews. But education really mattered. People who bothered to actually, and Mann's a great example, who actually bothered to learn what rabbinic midrash was, who read Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews, which I bet a lot of you have on your libraries at home. You know what? When people began to learn about Judaism a little bit more on its own terms, rather than what they had just heard whispered maybe in their house growing up, or maybe snidely commented upon in passing in church, but actually got to know Jews and Judaism in a more objective or educated fashion, it really did matter. Not so much in the initial breakaway, but after that. And social context really, really turns out to have mattered a lot, because there were some people who, there was, for every Helmut von Gerlach, that Prussian nobleman who traveled right to left politically and became a defender of the Jews, there were also I found plenty of people who had a kind of ambivalence about, say, the German role in the economy. They thought the Jewish role in the German economy. They thought Jews played an outsized role in the German economy and in the modern economy. A very famous, now totally forgotten economist by the name of Werner Sombart. He thought Jews really did play an outsized role. And you know what? When he first published this and wrote this in the turn of the century, he got a lot of speaking invitations from Zionist clubs and other groups because they took him as somebody who was ultimately celebrating Jewish entrepreneurialism. In the end, you can know where I'm going with this. At the end of the day, though that was a very brief interlude in Sombart's intellectual journey, and he became a Nazi. My feeling is, had he fallen with a different crowd, had he gotten a more full picture, he could have become he could have remained a defender of Jews and Judaism. Okay, how is it comprehensible to move from dislike of the Jews in the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, from dislike to death marches, mass shootings, crematoria, all of which we know, as well as we could know any historical fact, happened during the Holocaust. So that's the first question, and the comment is more about today and taking the pulse of today's America, which seems all of us, and not just America, Europe too, all of a sudden a lot of anti-Semitic expression seems to have come out from under the ground, and the comment includes the thought that, well, it must really have in some quarters long been there for it to come out like that. So those are two absolutely gigantic questions, obviously. And I'll just give you I don't think my opinion's worth more than anyone else's, but I'll give you my opinion. My opinion on the first point is that it is ultimately incomprehensible. However much the Holocaust has been studied, and however many different theories about, ranging all the way from the whole German army and much of the German populace from 1933 to the outbreak of the war had been propagandized into a more violent anti-Semitism, and then the brutality of the war, especially in the East, just opened the gates to any kind of activity. That's one side. It was really a fairly conscious march forward from 1933 to 1942, all the way to the other side of the debate, which I tend toward that side. But the other side of the debate is the people who were put into the police battalions, who were actually the ones who advanced behind the German armies and did the mass shootings in the summer of 1941, early 1942, the people who worked the kind of bent idea of loyalty to their fellow soldiers who were taking the heavy heat 100 or 200 miles further east in whatever battle the Russians and the Germans were having that week. So the range of explanations is there, but do any of them really explain? No, I don't think so. So I think I'm on the same page with you. And, it's just the sort of thing where that kind of brutality is incomprehensible. If you'd like to read a very short and very good reflection on this by somebody who went through these events, the Israeli, well, he was born in Hungary, got his doctorate in Germany, moved to Israel. The historian Yaakov Katz, wrote an article in Commentary magazine maybe 30, 40 years ago, Was the Holocaust Predictable? So I recommend reading that. It's very, very good and very short. That's a good place for me to stop, but so let me thank you very much for coming.